I still remember the exact moment I stepped outside the University of Rochester that snowy afternoon, feeling completely drained after final exams. My plan had been to drive straight home to Ohio in time to head out with my parents for my cousin's New Year's Eve party. But a flight delay forced me onto these dark, winding back roads long after everyone else had already left. By the time I finally got behind the wheel, the sky was as black as ink. Only the glow of the distant street lamps reminded me I was still in the real world. The Cleveland Browns' recent 0-16 season gnawed at the back of my mind like an unrelenting ache. As a die-hard fan, I felt personally let down by every embarrassing loss. It might seem silly to those who do not care about football, but it had been a rough year, and the Browns' failure was just one more discouraging note. I was in a foul mood, and I did not bother trying to hide it from myself. Rosie, my golden retriever, sensed my frustration and rested her chin on the passenger seat, as if her quiet presence alone could ease my bitterness. My father, always one for punctuality, had left hours earlier to join the rest of the family in welcoming the new year. He took our main car, which runs far more smoothly in the winter. That left me with the older sedan, its heater only half reliable, and its headlights dimmer than I liked. My mother, ever practical, had stayed behind briefly to make sure I had enough snacks, blankets, and, of course, her prized first aid kit safely stowed away. She kept reminding me to drive carefully, a look of concern shining in her eyes. Rosie was actually a last-minute decision on my mother's part. She hated the thought of me traveling these lonely roads by myself. It was not that I was unfamiliar with them. After all, I grew up in a small town outside Cleveland. But she knew how dicey the weather could be in late December. I was too proud to admit I needed the company, yet strangely relieved that my furry friend would be there if I found myself stranded or just plain miserable. The landscape felt oddly claustrophobic, despite being so open and empty. Now and then I would catch a glimpse of a farmhouse porch, light flickering against the darkness, only to watch it fade as I pressed on. The snow covering the fields seemed to glow a faint bluish white in the moonlight, but it did little to brighten the road ahead of me. I could almost hear the hush of the night, as if everything slept, except for me and my dog. Those first miles on the back road felt like a prelude to a bad dream. My thoughts tangled between annoyance at the family gathering I was missing and a strange, lingering tension I could not quite place. I told myself it was just the exhaustion and the bitter cold. In hindsight, it may have been something else entirely, a subtle warning of what the night still had in store. But at that moment, as I gripped the wheel with numb fingers, I just felt worn down by a year of letdowns and a looming sense of unease. I had been on the road for what felt like hours, though I suspect it was only a short while. The radio offered no real comfort, just old holiday tunes and talk stations winding down as the new year approached. In the solitude of those twisted back roads, I could almost forget that the rest of the world was celebrating. My head ached with the lingering disappointment of the Browns' 0-16 season, and the knowledge that I would miss my cousin's gathering made me feel even more isolated. It seemed strange to feel so alone on a night that most people spend surrounded by laughter and friends. Rosie, my golden retriever, had been unusually quiet, curled up on the passenger seat while I steered through the winding routes. The fields stretched endlessly in every direction, and the odd farmhouse light did little to pierce the darkness. Now and then I would talk to Rosie just to break the silence, though she mostly kept her gaze on the passing landscape. At least she was there to keep me company. I could thank my mother for insisting on that. Not long after I turned onto a narrower road with barely any streetlights, Rosie lifted her head and whined. At first, I tried reassuring her with a gentle pat, but she grew increasingly restless. I recognized the signs. She needed a bathroom break. With a sigh, I flicked on my turn signal, more out of habit than necessity, as there were no other cars in sight, and searched for a safe spot to pull over. It was the last thing I wanted to do on such a frigid night, but I knew I could not ignore her discomfort. Eventually, I spotted a small clearing at the edge of a wooded area and decided it was as good a place as any to stop. The tires crunched over a thin layer of snow and dead leaves as I eased the car to a halt. The moment I opened my door, an icy blast of wind cut right through me. I switched off the engine and left the headlights on so I could see at least a few paces ahead. The trees stood like silent sentinels in the distance, their bare branches scratching at the sky. Something about that forest felt unsettling, but I chalked it up to my frayed nerves. Rosie trotted out, her tail wagging faintly despite the cold. I hugged my jacket closer and glanced around, feeling the stark emptiness of the rural night press in on me. The hush was absolute, broken only by the rustle of branches and my own breathing. I tried to shake off the tension by focusing on Rosie as she wandered deeper into the clearing, sniffing at the snow. For a brief second, I almost forgot my sour mood. Then out of nowhere, a loud crashing noise came from somewhere in the woods. My heart jumped in my chest, and Rosie froze, ears perked and eyes wide. Before I could even call her name, she bolted toward the dark tree line. All thoughts of the cold vanished as I scrambled after her, cursing the sudden surge of adrenaline. The forest ahead loomed in front of us, every shadow magnified by my racing pulse. In that moment, I realized I was not just tired or lonely. I was afraid. Something out there had sent Rosie running into the night, and I had no choice but to follow her into the pitch-black unknown. I pushed through the thicket, branches scratching at my jacket, determined not to lose sight of Rosie. My breath caught in my throat each time I called her name, yet all I heard in return was an unsettling hush. The deeper I ventured, the more ominous the woods became. The faint glow from the car's headlights faded behind me, leaving only the pale sheen of moonlight on snow to guide my steps. I could not escape the feeling that I was trespassing somewhere I did not belong. Suddenly, I spotted a trembling form curled beneath a low branch. Relief flooded me for a split second when I realized it was Rosie. Then my flashlight beam settled on the deep red, staining the fur around her shoulder. My heart pounded as I knelt beside her. She let out a subdued whimper, and I could feel her entire body shaking. This was more than a scrape from a broken twig or a startled animal's claw. Something sharp had pierced her skin. The realization made my stomach churn. While I tried to steady my nerves and tend to her as best I could, another sharp crack shattered the silence. It came from somewhere off to our right, but in that void of darkness, it felt like it was right behind me. Rosie stiffened, and for a moment, she seemed torn between fleeing again or cowering in place. My flashlight wavered across the trees, and that was when I saw them, 3 shadowy shapes standing just at the edge of the clearing. They were like outlines against the deeper black of the forest. I could not make out faces or even details of clothing. They were too far away and too enveloped by the shadows, but I knew without a doubt that their attention was on me and Rosie. My fear surged, and a primal instinct kicked in. I needed to run. Rosie was hurt, and we were alone in a place where no one would hear us if things took a turn for the worse. I whispered what little comfort I could to her, then carefully lifted her into my arms, bracing for the pain it caused her. Stumbling through the snow-laden undergrowth, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures streaking after us. The crunch of my boots felt deafening in that quiet. Rosie's warm weight in my arms anchored me, but every step reminded me she needed help, and soon. My mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. Who were those people? What did they want? How did Rosie end up with a stab wound in the middle of nowhere? Adrenaline fueled our final dash toward the car. Twigs snapped beneath me, and I nearly lost my footing more than once. When I finally caught a glimpse of my headlights, it felt like seeing the first sign of daylight after a horrific nightmare. I threw open the passenger door and eased Rosie inside, glancing up just in time to see those three shapes lingering at the tree line. For a moment, it felt like they were just as fixed on us as we were on them. Then I jumped into the driver's seat, heart pounding, and started the engine. Our only thought was to leave that place behind before anything worse could happen. I did not slow down until I reached a busier stretch of road where headlights passed sporadically in the distance. My own hands trembled on the steering wheel, and the sound of Rosie's labored breathing pressed on my chest like a weighted blanket. At last, I pulled into a small gravel rest area, just barely illuminated by a single, flickering lamppost. My mind spun with the events of the last few minutes, every nerve still on edge from what we had left behind in the woods. Shutting off the engine, I glanced over at Rosie, who was curled up against the seat, her body shaking from pain and cold. The dark stains on her fur made my stomach churn. I remembered the first aid kit my mother had so carefully stowed away in the trunk. She always insisted on being prepared, and for once I was silently grateful for her thoroughness. Carefully, I opened the car door, braced myself against the biting wind, and retrieved the kit. Kneeling next to Rosie, I dabbed at the wound with gauze and antiseptic pads, trying to be as gentle as possible. She whimpered, and my chest tightened. My mother's warning echoed in my mind, something about how dangerous it was to drive alone on these back roads so late at night. If only she could have known how right she would be. At least I had the supplies I needed to keep Rosie stable until we could get to a proper vet. That thought kept my hands steady as I wrapped her shoulder in a bandage, telling her over and over again that she would be all right. I realized then just how close we had come to a far worse fate. The memory of those three figures at the tree line left me with a lingering sense of dread. I could not stop replaying that moment in my head, the way they stood there, silent and still, as though they had no intention of running away. No matter how hard I tried, I could not guess who they were or why they would harm an innocent dog. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made, and the more determined I became to leave it in the past. Returning to the driver's seat, I breathed a heavy sigh. The right thing to do might have been to call the authorities, but I could not summon the courage. Something told me no one would truly believe my story. I pictured my father's doubtful expression and my mother's alarmed questions. Worse yet, I thought about how it would ruin everyone's celebration, especially my cousin's gathering, which was meant to be a happy family reunion. In the end, I found myself choosing the simpler path. I would keep quiet. I turned the key in the ignition once more, and the engine rumbled to life. As I pulled back onto the road, Rosie lay beside me, as drained and shaken as I felt. I told myself that we were safe now, that soon we would be in our own driveway, away from whatever terror lurked out there in the freezing Ohio night. Yet the experience clung to me like a shadow, a reminder that the world can turn from ordinary to dangerous in a single heartbeat. Even once we reached home, I knew that secret would remain mine, and mine alone, for a long time to come.